Dawn, September 13th, 1759. 32-year-old General James Wolfe crouched in the lead boat, drifting silently toward the cliffs of Quebec through darkness. Behind him, 48 more boats carried 4,500 British soldiers toward a near-vertical cliff face that French commanders considered unscalable. Wolfe was chronically ill, rheumatism, kidney stones, possibly tuberculosis, and had spent the previous weeks bedridden with fever whilst his siege of Quebec collapsed into frustration and failure. Now he was risking everything on a night landing that, if discovered, would trap his men at the cliff base to be slaughtered from above. The stakes were absolute. Quebec was the key to Canada. Canada was the prize of the 7 Years' War's North American theatre, and whoever controlled Canada would dominate the continent for centuries. 13,000 French defenders held a fortress city on 300-foot cliffs that nature itself seemed to have designed as impregnable. If Wolfe failed here, his career was finished, and Britain's best chance to conquer New France would evaporate with the coming winter. Within hours, Wolfe would stand on the Plains of Abraham, having achieved the impossible, forcing the French commander, Marquis de Montcalm, to fight in open battle. Within 15 minutes of that battle beginning, Wolfe would be mortally wounded. As French forces broke and fled, Wolfe's last words would enter legend. "Now, God be praised, I will die in peace." He'd won Canada for Britain, but wouldn't live to see the victory that reshaped North America, influenced the American Revolution, and created modern Canada. If you're fascinated by audacious military strategy, battles that changed history, and the human cost of empire building, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened on September 13th, 1759, was one of history's most dramatic military gambles, and it succeeded. But how did a chronically ill 32-year-old general with 4,500 troops defeat a fortified city defended by 13,000? The answer reveals audacity that borders on madness and luck that borders on miraculous, and it changed the world forever. The 7 Years' War that engulfed the world between 1756 and 1763 was truly global. European armies clashing in Germany, British and French fleets battling from the Caribbean to India, colonial forces fighting across 3 continents. But nowhere were the stakes higher than in North America, where Britain and France contested control of an entire continent. The winner would dominate North American trade, settlement, and strategic position for centuries. The loser would be expelled from the mainland entirely. By 1759, France's position in North America had become desperate. New France, the vast territory stretching from Quebec through the Great Lakes to Louisiana, contained perhaps 60,000 colonists scattered across an enormous territory. Britain's 13 colonies, by contrast, held over 1.5 million people crammed along the Atlantic coast, hungry for westward expansion. French advantages lay in geography and alliances. They controlled the St. Lawrence River Gateway, the Great Lakes interior, and the Mississippi Valley. Their native allies, particularly in the Ohio Country and Great Lakes region, provided military support, intelligence, and mastery of wilderness warfare that European armies couldn't match. But numbers and resources favored Britain overwhelmingly. William Pitt, Britain's Prime Minister, had committed enormous resources to conquering Canada. The 1758 campaign had captured Louisbourg, the fortress guarding the St. Lawrence's mouth, in July after brutal siege warfare. Fort Frontenac on Lake Ontario fell in August, severing French supply lines to the interior. Fort Duquesne, the strategic Ohio River fort that French and native forces had defended successfully for years, was finally abandoned in November as British and colonial forces approached. These victories isolated New France from reinforcement and resupply. But Quebec itself, the capital, the fortress city, the symbolic and strategic heart of French power in North America, remained untaken. And at Fort Carillon on Lake Champlain in July 1758, French forces under Montcalm had inflicted catastrophic defeat on General Abercrombie's army, killing or wounding 2,000 British and colonial troops in a single afternoon's fighting. Quebec would not fall easily. The city's geography made it a natural fortress. Quebec sat on cliffs rising 300 feet above the St. Lawrence River, 180 miles inland from the ocean. The upper town crowned the heights, protected by walls, batteries, and the sheer cliff face itself. The lower town at river level housed the port where ships could dock, but it was commanded by guns on the heights. North of the city, the St. Charles River created a natural moat. East of the city, the Montmorency River's gorge and waterfalls provided another barrier. West of Quebec, the cliffs continued for miles. The only practical approach was from the Beauport shore east of the city, where flatter ground allowed army deployment, and where Montcalm had fortified entrenchments and positioned his main force. Any British attack would face these natural obstacles, backed by 13,000 to 16,000 French regulars, Canadian militia, and native allies under Montcalm's command. Montcalm himself was 47 years old, a professional soldier who'd fought in European wars before being sent to Canada in 1756. He'd won defensive victories at Fort Carillon and had successfully defended Quebec's approaches for years through intelligent use of terrain and fortifications. His strategy for 1759 was simple and sound. Stay behind Quebec's walls and field fortifications. Let the British exhaust themselves attacking unfavorable positions. Wait for winter to force their withdrawal. Time was Montcalm's ally. The St. Lawrence froze in winter, trapping any British fleet that remained. The campaign season lasted only from June through September. If Montcalm could hold 4 months, he'd win by default. Against this formidable defense, Pitt sent James Wolfe with 8,500 troops and Admiral Saunders' fleet of 49 warships and 140 transports. Wolfe was 32 years old, young for independent command of a major expedition. He'd been a soldier since age 14, commissioned ensign at 15, and had fought at Culloden at 18. European campaigns in the 1740s had given him experience, and his performance as brigade commander at Louisbourg's siege in 1758 had earned him notice. He was brave, energetic, and had shown tactical initiative. But he'd never commanded independently, never faced the responsibility of an entire campaign's success or failure resting on his decisions alone. Wolfe's health was terrible and deteriorating. He suffered chronic rheumatism that left him in constant pain. Kidney stones caused excruciating episodes. Some historians believe he had tuberculosis, though diagnosis at this distance is speculative. He was thin, physically unimpressive, with red hair and features that contemporaries described as homely. But his drive was extraordinary. He'd spent his entire adult life in the army, rising through combination of competence, bravery, and powerful patrons. William Pitt had chosen him over more senior officers, specifically because Wolfe had demonstrated aggressive instincts at Louisbourg. Pitt wanted a commander who'd attack, not one who'd sit in siege lines waiting. Wolfe intended to prove Pitt's faith justified. He also carried personal motivations beyond military ambition. He was engaged to Catherine Lowther, a woman he loved deeply, and hoped this campaign would secure his reputation and fortune, allowing them to marry. He wrote her letters filled with romantic sentiment and determination to succeed. The prospect of returning victorious to marry Catherine drove him as much as professional ambition. But beneath the confidence, Wolfe knew he was unproven. If he failed at Quebec, his career was finished, and his hopes of marriage might die with his military reputation. Admiral Saunders' achievement in bringing the fleet up the St. Lawrence was itself remarkable. The river was treacherous, with uncharted sections, narrow channels, and rocks that could gut wooden warships. French pilots had been captured and forced to guide British ships, but even with their help, navigation was dangerous. That the entire fleet reached Quebec intact demonstrated British naval skill and Saunders' competent leadership. The fleet provided firepower, supplies, and mobility that allowed Wolfe to move troops rapidly. Without Saunders' ships, the campaign would have been impossible. Wolfe arrived off Quebec on June 26, 1759. He had until October at most, 4 months to capture a fortress city held by forces nearly twice his numbers. His initial reconnaissance confirmed what everyone knew. Direct assault on Quebec's cliffs was suicide. Montcalm's entrenchments at Beauport were formidable. The city could be bombarded from across the river, but bombardment wouldn't force surrender. Somehow, Wolfe had to force Montcalm out from behind his fortifications to fight in open field, where British regulars' discipline and training would give decisive advantage. But how? The campaign began with frustration. British forces occupied Ile d'Orléans and Pointe-Lévis on the south shore, establishing camps and artillery batteries. Bombardment of Quebec's lower town began, destroying buildings and causing civilian casualties, but not threatening Montcalm's defensive positions. On July 28, French forces attempted a dramatic fireship attack, sending burning vessels downriver toward the British fleet at night. British sailors calmly grappled the burning ships, towed them safely aside, and watched them burn out harmlessly. The attack's spectacular failure embarrassed the French and demonstrated British naval competence under pressure. But Wolfe needed a battle, not a siege. On July 31st, he attempted to force one at Montmorency. His plan was to attack French positions at the Montmorency Falls, hoping to break through their left flank. The attack was ambitious, an amphibious assault timed to low tide, with grenadiers leading the assault on fortified French redoubts. It failed catastrophically. The grenadiers attacked prematurely before support troops were in position, charging uphill into concentrated French fire. The result was slaughter. 443 British casualties, 210 killed, 233 wounded, against 60 French casualties. The elite grenadiers were shattered. A thunderstorm forced withdrawal, and Wolfe retreated with his first attempt at forcing battle, ending in humiliating defeat. July and August became grinding frustration. Wolfe sent raiding parties up and down the river, burning French settlements, destroying crops, and terrorizing civilians in attempts to draw Montcalm out. These harsh tactics accomplished nothing strategically. Montcalm stayed behind his fortifications, knowing time was his ally. Dysentery spread through British camps, sickening hundreds and weakening the effective force. Wolfe's own health collapsed in late August. He was bedridden with fever and pain, unable to function for days whilst the campaign season slipped away. His 3 brigadiers, Monckton, Townshend, and Murray, grew skeptical of Wolfe's leadership. They submitted proposals for alternative strategies, essentially questioning his competence. Wolfe was isolated, ill, watching his campaign fail whilst unable to force the battle he needed. September approached. Winter loomed. The campaign was collapsing, and with it, Wolfe's career and Britain's hopes of conquering Canada. The answer came from desperation and reconnaissance. Throughout late July and August, British ships had sailed upriver past Quebec, testing French defences and surveying the southern shore. What they discovered was that west of Quebec, the cliffs were less uniformly steep. In several places, narrow paths or steep slopes offered theoretical access to the heights. More importantly, if British forces landed upriver, west of Quebec, they'd cut Montcalm's supply line to Montreal and the interior. Montcalm would have to fight or abandon Quebec. This was the leverage Wolfe needed. But the risks were extraordinary. Any landing upriver required navigating the St. Lawrence at night, silently approaching shore in darkness, then scaling cliffs whilst French sentries stood guard above. If discovered during the climb, British troops would be trapped at the cliff base and massacred from above. If the landing force was too small, French defenders could overwhelm it. If too large, secrecy would be impossible. The timing had to be perfect. High tide to bring boats close to shore, darkness to hide movement, and coordination between naval vessels and landing troops that allowed no margin for error. Wolfe's brigadiers proposed variations of an upriver landing in late August. Wolfe, recovering enough from his illness to resume command, studied their proposals and intelligence reports. He chose Anse-au-Foulon, a small cove roughly 2 miles upriver from Quebec, as the landing point. The cliffs there rose about 180 feet, but a narrow path zigzagged up the cliff face. Intelligence suggested French defences at that point were minimal, perhaps 48 to 100 men of the Guienne regiment stationed at the cliff top. The path was considered too steep and exposed for serious attack, so Montcalm hadn't heavily reinforced it. Wolfe's plan was audacious to the point of recklessness. He'd embark 4,500 troops into boats after dark on September 12th. The boats would drift downriver with the tide and current, approaching Anse-au-Foulon around 4 o'clock in the morning of September 13th. An advance guard of light infantry, 24 volunteers, would land first, scale the cliff in darkness, and overwhelm the French picket at the top. Once the path was secured, the main force would climb. By dawn, Wolfe intended to have 4,500 British soldiers on the Plains of Abraham, the plateau west of Quebec, drawn up in battle formation, forcing Montcalm to attack or lose the city. Everything could go wrong. French sentries might discover the boats approaching and raise alarm. The advance guard might fail to scale the cliff in darkness. The French picket might hold long enough to summon reinforcements. The main force might be caught half-deployed, vulnerable to counterattack. Bougainville commanded French forces farther upriver, with about 3,000 men who could march to Anse-au-Foulon if alerted. Weather could turn, making the landing impossible. Montcalm might refuse battle even with British forces landed, retreating into Quebec and forcing prolonged siege. Any of these failures would mean disaster. Wolfe's subordinate commanders accepted the plan with resignation more than enthusiasm. Brigadier Townshend privately thought Wolfe was incompetent and resented serving under him. Brigadier Murray had doubts about the landing's feasibility. Brigadier Monckton loyally supported Wolfe, but recognized the enormous risks. But what alternative existed? Continuing bombardment and raids achieved nothing. Winter would force withdrawal in weeks. One desperate gamble offered the only chance of victory. So the preparations began. September 10th through 12th were spent in final reconnaissance and positioning. Officers scouted the cliff face and landing point as closely as they could without alerting French defenders. British ships moved up and down river, creating confusion about where an attack might come. Montcalm, spread thin defending multiple possible landing sites, couldn't concentrate his forces without knowing where Wolfe would strike. French intelligence suggested British movements indicated an attack, but the location remained unknown. Montcalm positioned forces at Beauport, in Quebec, at Cap Rouge upriver, and along various points, gambling that he could respond once the British revealed their target. French security worked against them. The French captain of the guard at Anse-au-Foulon, Louis Dupont du Chambon de Vergor, was politically connected but militarily mediocre. He commanded the small picket at the cliff top, but had allowed many of his men to go work on nearby farms, leaving perhaps 48 soldiers actually on duty. Communication between French units was poor. A French supply convoy was expected to come downriver at some point, which meant sentries had been told to expect boats. When the password was changed, not all posts received the new one. These small failures of discipline and communication would prove fatal. Wolfe spent September 12th preparing mentally and emotionally. He wrote letters to his mother and to Catherine Lowther, his fiancée, knowing he might not survive the next day. He updated his will. According to later accounts, he recited lines from Thomas Gray's Elegy written in a country churchyard, whilst being rowed toward the landing. The paths of glory lead but to the grave. Whether he actually spoke these words is historically debated, but they fit his romantic, fatalistic mindset. He was 32 years old, chronically ill, leading a desperate gamble that would end his career in triumph or ruin. The possibility of death was very real, and Wolfe was preparing for it, whilst simultaneously preparing to win. As darkness fell on September 12th, 4,500 British troops embarked into boats at their staging points upriver from Anse-au-Foulon. The plan called for the boats to drift downstream with the tide and current, making minimal noise, approaching the landing point around 4 in the morning. Admiral Saunders executed a diversionary attack against Beauport with ships and boats, drawing Montcalm's attention eastward whilst Wolfe's force moved west. The timing was precise and unforgiving. Too early, and darkness wouldn't hide them fully. Too late, and dawn would reveal their approach. The tide had to be high enough to bring boats close to the cliff base. Everything depended on coordination, silence, and fortune. Wolfe was in the lead boat with the advance guard of light infantry. Captain William de Laune led the 24 volunteers who'd climb first. These men were selected for strength, climbing ability, and courage. Their mission was to scale 180 feet of cliff in darkness, overwhelm whatever French defenders they found at the top, and hold the landing point until the main force could ascend. If they failed, everyone in the boats below would likely die. The boats drifted through darkness. Soldiers sat in absolute silence. The only sounds were water against hulls and quiet commands from naval officers steering. The St. Lawrence's current carried them downstream toward Anse-au-Foulon. Every man knew they were approaching the most dangerous moment, when French sentries might discover them, when alarm could be raised, when musket fire from the cliffs could turn boats into coffins. At approximately 4 o'clock in the morning, the lead boats approached the landing point. French sentries on the cliff top heard sounds and called out challenges. A Highland officer in Wolfe's force who spoke French answered, claiming to be part of the expected supply convoy. The sentries hesitated. The password wasn't matching, but French supply boats were supposed to be coming. Communication failures meant they weren't certain. In those seconds of confusion, British boats grounded on the shore. The advance guard leapt out and began climbing. The cliff face was nearly vertical, muddy, tangled with roots and brush. In darkness, with no light beyond starlight, the climb was treacherous. Men grabbed roots and rocks, pulling themselves upward, trying to stay silent. De Laune and his volunteers were climbed with desperate speed, knowing every second mattered. The French picket at the top still hadn't realized what was happening. When the first British soldiers emerged at the cliff top, there was a brief, savage fight. Musket shots cracked in the darkness. Bayonets flashed. The French picket, perhaps 48 men, many of them scattered or sleeping, couldn't organize effective resistance. Within minutes, the British advance guard controlled the cliff-top landing point. Now the main force could ascend. 4,500 troops climbed the cliff in darkness, using the narrow path that zigzagged up the slope. It took hours. Men slipped and fell. Equipment clattered. But French response was confused and slow. Vergor, the French commander, was wounded in the initial fight, and his picket routed. Messages were sent to French headquarters, but in darkness and confusion, French officers didn't immediately grasp what had happened. Bougainville's force upriver didn't receive word in time to march. Montcalm at Beauport, distracted by Saunders' diversionary attack, learned of the landing, but didn't initially believe it was the main assault. By 6 o'clock in the morning, as dawn broke on September 13th, 4,500 British soldiers stood on the plains of Abraham in battle formation. Wolfe had achieved the impossible. His troops were now between Quebec and Montreal, threatening Montcalm's supply line. The fortress city's natural defences, the cliffs that made it impregnable, had been circumvented. Montcalm now faced the choice Wolfe had forced him into: fight in open field or abandon Quebec. Dawn revealed the impossible. Montcalm received reports that British troops were on the plains of Abraham and initially refused to believe them. The cliffs were unscalable. Anse-au-Foulon was defended. British forces couldn't possibly have 4,500 men on the plateau west of Quebec. But scouts confirmed the reports, and Montcalm rode out personally to see. When he crested the rise and saw British redcoats formed in battle lines barely a mile from Quebec's walls, he reportedly said, "This is serious." It was magnificent understatement. The defensive position he'd held all summer had been outflanked in a single night. Montcalm faced an agonizing decision. He could retreat into Quebec's fortifications, wait for Bougainville's 3,000 men to arrive from upriver, and potentially trap Wolfe's force between two French armies. This was the cautious, probably correct choice. But it meant abandoning the high ground, allowing British forces to consolidate their position, and risking siege. Montcalm chose instead to attack immediately with the forces he had available. His reasoning, though debated by historians, appears to have been that letting Wolfe establish artillery on the plains threatened Quebec directly, and that attacking whilst the British were still disorganized might catch them vulnerable. It was aggressive, risky, and exactly what Wolfe needed Montcalm to do. The French army assembled at Beauport and marched toward the plains. Montcalm gathered approximately 4,500 troops, roughly matching Wolfe's numbers, from the forces immediately available. He left garrisons in Quebec and at other defensive positions, which meant he wasn't bringing his full strength of 13,000. French regulars in white uniforms formed the corps, disciplined European troops comparable to British regulars. Canadian militia, dressed in various civilian clothes and carrying hunting rifles, filled out the ranks. Some native allies joined the flanks. The army marched westward along the road from Beauport toward the Plains of Abraham, drums beating, flags flying, moving to battle. Wolfe deployed his 4,500 troops in the classic British formation, a thin red line, 2 ranks deep, stretching across the plains. From left to right, his regiments formed: 35th Foot, Louisbourg Grenadiers, 28th Foot, 43rd Foot, 47th Foot, 78th Highlanders, and 58th Foot on the flanks. The line was perhaps half a mile wide, but only 2 men deep, looking impossibly fragile compared to the dense French columns approaching. But this formation maximized British firepower. Every soldier could fire his musket. British infantry drill emphasized disciplined, coordinated volleys at close range. The thin line was actually a killing mechanism refined through decades of European warfare. French forces deployed in columns, dense formations perhaps 100 men wide and 10 or more ranks deep. Columns were easier to maneuver, provided psychological impact through mass, and could charge home with bayonets more easily than extended lines. But they had a fatal weakness against disciplined linear fire. Only the front ranks could shoot. The men in rear ranks simply pushed forward, unable to use their weapons until front ranks fell. Against armies that broke before columns closed, this worked. Against British regulars who held position and fired coordinated volleys, columns became targets. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, the armies were in position. Approximately 300 yards separated them. Wolfe walked in front of his lines, tall, conspicuous in his bright uniform, making himself visible to his troops and to French marksmen. British officers did this deliberately. Showing courage steadied the men who followed them. Wolfe carried a cane because of his chronic pain, but refused to show weakness. His soldiers watched him, drew confidence from his presence, and prepared for what would come. The French advance began. Militia and native allies on the wings opened fire from perhaps 100 yards, too far for musket accuracy, but a natural response to tension. British troops stood motionless, holding their fire. Wolfe's orders were explicit. Wait until the enemy reaches 40 yards, then fire on command. The distance closed. 90 yards, 80, 70. French columns continued advancing, closing the range, expecting the British line to fire or break. Neither happened. British soldiers stood with loaded muskets, watching their officers, waiting for the command. At 80 yards, a French ball struck Wolfe's right wrist. He wrapped it quickly and continued standing. The wound wasn't serious, but it demonstrated the danger. French irregular fire was causing casualties along the British line, men falling individually, gaps appearing. But British formations held. Officers kept men in position, steadying them, maintaining discipline. Still, they waited. The French were now 60 yards away, 50, 40. Fire! British officers shouted the command nearly simultaneously. 4,500 muskets discharged in a thunderous volley that echoed across the plains. The smoke was instant and choking, white clouds rolling across the battlefield, obscuring everything. But the effect was devastating. French front ranks collapsed, men falling by dozens, by hundreds. Lead balls traveling at 1,500 feet per second tore through flesh and bone at 40 yards range. The mathematical superiority of line formation over column became visible in corpses littering the ground. British soldiers reloaded with the mechanical efficiency of thousands of hours of drill. Bike cartridge, pour powder, ram ball, prime pan, Cockhammer. Present. Fire. 20 seconds later, the second volley crashed out. Then a third. The French columns staggered under impacts they'd never experienced before. European armies they'd faced hadn't stood this firm or fired this disciplined. The columns attempted to deploy into lines to return more effective fire, but deployment takes minutes, and British were firing every 20 seconds. Men were falling faster than formations could adjust. Wolfe, still standing in front of his lines, was hit again. This time the ball struck his groin or lower abdomen. Accounts vary but agree the wound was serious. He staggered, but remained upright. Moments later, another ball struck his chest. This was mortal. Wolfe collapsed, and soldiers rushed to carry him to the rear. He was conscious, aware of what was happening. Around him, the battle he'd forced was reaching its climax. The British line, having delivered 3 or 4 volleys in perhaps 90 seconds, fixed bayonets and charged. British infantry advancing with 17-inch steel blades was the culmination of firepower superiority. The French columns, shattered by volleys and seeing British charging, broke. What had been organized formations dissolved into men running. Officers tried to rally troops, but momentum was gone. The French army retreated toward Quebec in increasing disorder. Some units maintained cohesion, fighting rearguard actions. Most simply fled. The battle had lasted approximately 15 minutes from first shot to French retreat beginning. Wolfe lay dying behind the lines. Soldiers and officers gathered around him. Someone shouted, "They run! See how they run!" Wolfe, struggling to breathe with blood filling his lungs, asked, "Who run?" An officer replied, "The enemy, sir. They give way everywhere." Wolfe gave final orders. Send Webster's regiment to cut off the French retreat along the St. Charles River. Then he said, "Now, God be praised, I will die in peace," turned on his side, and died. It was approximately 10:15 in the morning. He'd lived just long enough to know he'd won. Montcalm, attempting to rally his retreating troops near Quebec's walls, was struck by canister shot or musket balls. Accounts differ. The wounds were mortal, shot through lower abdomen and thigh. His horse carried him into Quebec, where he was taken to surgeon's care. He knew immediately the wounds were fatal. When told he wouldn't survive the night, Montcalm reportedly said, "So much the better. I shall not live to see the surrender of Quebec." He died early the next morning, September 14th, and was buried in a shell crater in the floor of the Ursuline Chapel because the bombardment had made conventional burial impossible. Both commanders, the 32-year-old British general and the 47-year-old French general, died within 24 hours of the battle they'd fought. Wolfe had forced the battle and won it. Montcalm had accepted the battle and lost it. 15 minutes of sustained volley fire had decided the fate of New France, and both men who'd led their armies were dead before the strategic consequences became clear. British forces pursued the routed French to Quebec's walls, but didn't attempt immediate assault. The victory was decisive, but not complete. Quebec still held garrison forces, fortifications, and supplies. But Montcalm was dead, French field forces were shattered, and British troops controlled the plains overlooking the city. The siege that Wolfe had been unable to force all summer through bombardment and raids had been achieved through one night's audacity and 15 minutes disciplined firepower. Quebec's fall was now inevitable. The only question was when. The days following the battle were chaos tinged with grief. Wolfe's body was preserved and prepared for the voyage back to Britain. His officers, many of whom had criticized his leadership weeks earlier, now mourned the commander who'd achieved what they'd thought impossible. Brigadier Townshend, who'd privately despised Wolfe and sketched unflattering caricatures of him, assumed command of British forces. His first priority was consolidating the victory and forcing Quebec's surrender before French reinforcements could arrive, or winter-trapped British forces on the wrong side of the St. Lawrence. Quebec's defenders, reeling from Montcalm's death and the field army's destruction, attempted to organize resistance. Governor Vaudreuil, the colonial administrator who'd feuded with Montcalm throughout the campaign, still commanded garrison forces within the city. He had perhaps 5,000 troops available, regulars who'd been left in garrison during the battle, militia who'd fled back to the city, and survivors from the Plains of Abraham who'd made it inside the walls. The fortifications remained formidable. With determination and competent leadership, Quebec might have held for weeks or even months. But determination was precisely what Quebec's defenders lacked. The psychological impact of losing the supposedly invincible Montcalm and seeing the field army shattered in 15 minutes was devastating. French officers recognized that British forces now controlled the heights west of the city and could establish siege batteries that would pound Quebec at close range. Bougainville's 3,000 troops upriver remained a threat to British supply lines, but without Montcalm's leadership and with the field army destroyed, Bougainville couldn't mount effective counterattack. The strategic situation was hopeless, even if the immediate tactical position seemed defensible. British forces began establishing formal siege positions, bringing artillery up the cliffs to emplacements overlooking Quebec. The same cliffs that had made the city impregnable when British forces were below now worked against French defenders with British artillery above. Bombardment resumed, but now from positions that could target fortifications and garrison positions rather than just the lower town. French return fire was ineffective. The garrison was demoralized, short of ammunition, and losing hope. On September 18th, 5 days after the battle, Quebec surrendered. The articles of capitulation were relatively generous. French regulars would be transported back to France and paroled not to fight again in this war. Militia could return home. Canadian civilians would be protected from reprisal. British forces marched into Quebec that afternoon, taking possession of the fortress city that had defied them all summer. The Union flag rose over Quebec's citadel. New France's capital was British. But Quebec's fall didn't end the war in Canada. Montreal remained French-held, with perhaps 3,000 regulars and militia under Governor Vaudreuil's command. The French interior, the Great Lakes region, the Ohio country, the Illinois territory, still recognized French authority. The strategic reality, however, was that without Quebec, French Canada couldn't be supplied or reinforced from Europe. The St. Lawrence was Britain's. Montreal was isolated. The question wasn't whether French Canada would fall, but when and at what additional cost. The 1760 campaign completed what Wolfe's victory had made inevitable. 3 British armies converged on Montreal, Amherst advancing from Lake Ontario, Murray marching from Quebec, and Haviland moving from Lake Champlain. 17,000 British and colonial troops surrounded Montreal by September 1760. Vaudreuil, recognizing resistance was futile, surrendered on September 8, 1760. The Articles of Capitulation formally ended French military presence in Canada. French regulars were transported to France. Canadian militia were disbanded. French colonial administration was dissolved. Canada was British. Understanding why Wolfe succeeded requires examining tactical, leadership, and circumstantial factors that combined to produce British victory. The battle itself, 15 minutes of devastating volley fire, was decided by disciplined execution of British infantry doctrine against French tactics that had proven effective across Europe for decades, but failed catastrophically against British linear formations. British infantry tactics in 1759 represented decades of refinement. The 2-rank line formation maximized firepower by allowing every soldier to discharge his musket. Officers drilled troops obsessively in loading and firing sequences until the movements became automatic. A trained British infantryman could fire 3 to 4 shots per minute under ideal conditions, perhaps 2 to 3 in combat stress. At 40 yards range, the distance Wolfe's troops held fire until musket accuracy was sufficient that even smoothbore weapons hit consistently when fired in coordinated volleys. The mathematical advantage was overwhelming. 4,500 British troops in 2-rank line could deliver 9,000 musket balls per minute theoretically. In practice, allowing for reloading delays and casualties, British troops at Plains of Abraham probably fired 2,500 to 3,000 musket balls per minute during peak engagement. French column tactics prioritized shock and maneuverability over firepower. Columns were easier to command, could move quickly, and provided psychological intimidation through mass. Against Austrian, Prussian, and Russian armies whose troops broke before columns closed or whose return fire was undisciplined, French columns achieved victories repeatedly. But British infantry didn't break. They'd fought French columns in European wars and knew their tactics worked. At Plains of Abraham, French columns approached British lines expecting either British retreat or ragged return fire they could survive. Instead, they received coordinated volleys at close range that their formation couldn't answer. Only French front ranks, perhaps 400 to 600 men out of 4,500, could fire effectively. They were being shot at by 2,500 British muskets and could respond with perhaps 400. The firepower ratio was 6-1 in British favour. Wolfe's leadership combined audacity with calculation. The night landing at Anse-au-Foulon was risky, but not suicidal. Intelligence indicated weak French defences. Reconnaissance had identified the landing site and approach route. Timing was planned to exploit tide, darkness, and French confusion about supply convoys. When everything succeeded, and fortune certainly favoured British that night, Wolfe had forced the battle he needed on terms favourable to British tactics. His personal courage, walking in front of his lines during battle, steadied troops facing enemy fire. His decision to hold fire until 40 yards demonstrated understanding of British firepower advantages. Wolfe was young and inexperienced as independent commander, but his tactical instincts at Plains of Abraham were sound. Montcalm's mistakes were strategic, more than tactical. His decision to attack immediately with 4,500 troops, rather than waiting for Bougainville's 3,000, surrendered the advantages of time, position, and numbers. Had he waited, British would have been caught between two French forces, potentially forced to retreat down the cliffs they'd climbed, or risk being overwhelmed. But Montcalm worried that delay allowed British to entrench and establish artillery. His solution, attack before British consolidated, threw away French numerical superiority and gave Wolfe exactly the open field engagement British tactics dominated. Montcalm's column formations, standard French practice, were suicidal against disciplined British line fire, but he had limited alternatives with the troops available. The battle was lost in the strategic decision to fight immediately, not in the tactical execution of the fighting itself. Fortune favoured Britain enormously. The night landing's success depended on numerous factors beyond Wolfe's control. French sentries were confused by password changes and expected supply convoy. Vergor's picket was undermanned because he'd allowed soldiers to leave posts for farm work. Weather cooperated with the tide and darkness timing. Bougainville's force was positioned too far upriver to respond quickly. Any of these factors going differently could have made the landing catastrophic failure. Wolfe was bold, but he was also lucky. Great commanders need fortune as much as skill, and Wolfe had both on September 13th. British advantages extended beyond tactics. Naval superiority was fundamental. Saunders' fleet transported troops, provided fire support, and maintained supply lines that Montcalm couldn't effectively contest. British resources were vastly greater than French. William Pitt had committed enormous funds to the 1759 campaign, ensuring British forces had ammunition, supplies, and equipment adequate for extended operations. French forces in Canada were isolated, undersupplied, and new reinforcement from France was impossible once Louisbourg had fallen in 1758. Morale reflected these material realities. British troops believed they were winning a war their nation was investing massively in. French troops were defending territory their nation had effectively abandoned. French disadvantages were structural as much as immediate. Political divisions between Montcalm and Governor Vaudreuil had plagued French command throughout the campaign. Montcalm commanded regular troops, Vaudreuil commanded militia and colonial administration, and their mutual contempt prevented effective cooperation. Supply problems stemming from British naval blockade meant French forces often lacked ammunition and provisions. The defensive strategy that had worked earlier, letting British attack unfavourable positions, collapsed once Wolfe landed upriver, forcing battle. French tactical doctrine, proven effective in Europe, met British tactical doctrine proven effective against French in previous wars. The immovable object met the unstoppable force, and on September 13, 1759, British firepower proved superior. The strategic context of 1759's campaign extended beyond Quebec. General Amherst's army advancing from New York toward Montreal tied down French forces and supplies. The capture of Fort Niagara cut French access to Great Lakes and Western territories. French Canada was being strangled strategically, even as Quebec was being attacked directly. Wolfe's victory at Quebec was decisive, but it occurred within broader campaign that was systematically dismantling French power in North America. Had Wolfe failed, Amherst and others would have continued operations, and French Canada would still likely have fallen, though perhaps not until 1761 or 1762. Wolfe's achievement was forcing quick decision through audacious action, rather than slow strangulation through siege and attrition. Comparing Wolfe's campaign to other famous sieges and battles reveals both uniqueness and patterns. The night landing resembles special operations more than conventional 18th century warfare, commando raid rather than formal siege. The battle itself was conventional, linear formations exchanging fire, but the strategic setup was creative. Wolfe succeeded where other British commanders facing fortified positions had failed because he didn't attack the fortress directly, but maneuvered to force the defender to fight in open field. This required insight, courage, and circumstances that allowed the maneuver. Not every fortified position could be outflanked as Quebec was. Wolfe's solution worked for Quebec's specific geography and Montcalm's specific situation, but wasn't universally applicable. The cost of victory is easily obscured by celebrating success. Britain gained Canada, but the 7 Years' War's cost bankrupted the treasury. Post-war taxation of American colonies to help pay war debts contributed directly to colonial resentment that exploded into American Revolution 15 years later. The irony is profound. Britain conquered Canada partly to protect American colonies from French threat, then lost those colonies partly because the war's cost required taxation colonists rejected. Wolfe's victory was tactically brilliant and strategically decisive, but its long-term consequences included undermining the very colonial system it was fought to preserve. For Canada itself, conquest by Britain determined the nation's future character. French language and Catholic religion were preserved. British authorities recognized that forcing English culture on 60,000 French Canadians was impractical and destabilizing. The Quebec Act of 1774 guaranteed French civil law and Catholic practice, creating framework for French-Canadian cultural survival under British political rule. Modern Canada's bilingual character, the distinct Quebecois identity, and ongoing tensions between Anglophone and Francophone Canada all stem from September 13, 1759, and Britain's decision to govern conquered territory with relatively tolerant policies. Native peoples, who'd allied with France hoping to resist British colonial expansion, lost their most important European ally. British victory enabled westward expansion of settlement that overwhelmed native communities, seized their lands, and destroyed their political independence. For native nations from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi, Wolfe's victory was catastrophic. The French had been imperfect allies, but had provided trade, weapons, and diplomatic support that helped native peoples resist British encroachment. With France expelled from mainland North America, native resistance to British expansion lost crucial support. Pontiac's rebellion in 1763 demonstrated native determination to resist, but without French backing, such resistance was ultimately futile against British resources and population. James Wolfe's legacy was secured the moment he died victorious on the Plains of Abraham. Death in the hour of triumph transforms military commanders into legends, and Wolfe's transformation was immediate and overwhelming. Britain in 1759 desperately needed heroes. The 7 Years' War had been expensive, brutal, and until 1759, frustrating. Earlier campaigns had seen defeats and setbacks. Then came the Annus Mirabilis, the year of victories, when British and Allied forces won stunning successes across the globe. Minden, Guadeloupe, Lagos, Quiberon Bay, and crowning them all, Quebec. Wolfe's dramatic death gave victory narrative arc that resonated with contemporary audiences. Young hero, impossible odds, supreme sacrifice, triumphant success. It was theatre as much as history. Within weeks of his death, Wolfe was being celebrated in sermons, poems, newspapers, and public commemorations. His funeral in Greenwich on November 20th, 1759, drew enormous crowds. King George II, upon hearing of Wolfe's death, reportedly said, "Mad, is he? Then I hope he will bite some of my other generals." Whether apocryphal or genuine, the quote captured public sentiment. Better one mad general who won impossible victories than a dozen cautious ones who won nothing. Parliament voted to erect a monument to Wolfe in Westminster Abbey, placing him among Britain's most honoured dead. His family was granted pensions. His reputation was sanctified. Benjamin West's 1770 painting, The Death of General Wolfe, completed Wolfe's mythologization. West depicted Wolfe dying in composition, deliberately echoing dissent from the cross paintings, Christ-like sacrifice for nation rather than sins. Officers surround him in attitudes of grief and respect. A native warrior sits contemplatively nearby, noble savage acknowledging superior civilization's triumph. The scene is entirely fabricated. Wolfe probably died with fewer witnesses, less dignity, and more pain than West showed. But historical accuracy was irrelevant. West was creating national myth, the general who died for empire, whose sacrifice secured continental dominion, whose memory would inspire future generations. The painting was reproduced in engravings that reached vast audiences. It became the defining image of Wolfe and of British imperial triumph. Towns, streets, and ships were named for Wolfe. Wolfe's Cove in Quebec commemorates his landing site. Cities in North America and Britain bear his name. British ships HMS Wolfe carried his memory into battles he'd never fought. The 47th Foot became Wolfe's regiment, honouring his earlier association with them. His birthplace in Westerham became pilgrimage site. His correspondence was published, his tactical writings studied. He became reference point for discussing military leadership and sacrifice. To call someone another Wolfe meant brave, audacious, willing to risk everything for victory. But historical assessment is more complicated than hagiography allows. Wolfe was undeniably brave and ultimately successful. His decision to attempt the night landing showed creativity and willingness to accept enormous risk. His leadership on the battlefield was personally courageous, walking in front of lines under fire-inspired troops. But his generalship earlier in the campaign was questionable. The Montmorency disaster killed over 400 British troops in failed assault Wolfe ordered. His raiding parties burned Canadian settlements and destroyed crops in harsh tactics that achieved nothing militarily. His relationship with subordinate brigadiers deteriorated to point where they questioned his competence in writing. He succeeded at Quebec partly through boldness and skill, but also through fortune that could easily have gone differently. Modern military historians debate Wolfe's place among great commanders. He won one decisive battle commanding independently and died immediately afterward, giving him no opportunity to demonstrate whether Quebec was genius or luck. Comparing him to Wellington or Marlborough, who won multiple campaigns over years, is impossible because Wolfe's career was so brief. His tactical skill was sound, understanding when and how to use British linear firepower advantages. His strategic insight, forcing Montcalm to fight in open field, was correct. But assessing whether he'd have succeeded in subsequent campaigns is speculative. He remains fascinating precisely because his story is incomplete. Brilliant young commander who died at moment of triumph, leaving posterity to wonder what he might have achieved had he lived. Montcalm's legacy is more tragic and complex. In France, He was mourned as commander who'd defended Canada competently with inadequate resources against overwhelming British advantages. His death was seen as heroic, but ultimately futile, symbol of France's losing struggle for North America. French military historians debated his tactical decisions at Plains of Abraham. Some argued attacking immediately was rash. Others defended his reasoning that delay allowed British to consolidate. The consensus eventually recognized that Montcalm faced no good options. Once Wolfe landed upriver, Montcalm could either attack with available forces or wait for reinforcements whilst British established artillery. Both choices were risky. He chose the risk that failed. In Quebec, Montcalm is remembered more fondly. He defended New France, died trying to protect it, and was buried in Quebec's soil. The fact that both Wolfe and Montcalm died in battle created certain symmetry. Neither lived to see final consequences of their actions. Both died fighting for causes they believed in. Montcalm Avenue in Quebec City and various memorials commemorate him. He's viewed as tragic figure. European professional soldier sent to defend inadequately supported colony against overwhelming force, doing his best with insufficient resources, ultimately defeated not by incompetence, but by impossible strategic situation. The battle's long-term consequences shaped North America's development in ways Wolfe and Montcalm couldn't have imagined. British conquest of Canada removed French threat that had helped keep American colonies dependent on British military protection. With French gone, colonists felt more confident asserting independence from British authority. Taxation imposed to help pay 7 years' war debts, including cost of conquering Canada, provoked colonial resistance that escalated into American Revolution. The Quebec Act of 1774, which guaranteed French-Canadian Catholic and legal rights, was cited by American revolutionaries as evidence of British tyranny, supporting Catholicism they despised whilst taxing Protestant colonies they represented. Wolfe's victory indirectly contributed to losing American colonies through removing threat that kept them loyal and creating debts that required taxation. For Canada itself, September 13, 1759, was foundational moment. British conquest began process creating bilingual nation with distinct French and English communities. French-Canadian survival as cultural entity, distinct from Anglophone Canada, stems from British decision to preserve French language and law rather than imposing English culture. Modern Canadian identity, tolerant of linguistic and cultural differences, federalist rather than unitary, bicultural at its core, has roots in British conquest's aftermath. Quebec's ongoing debates about sovereignty and relationship to rest of Canada trace directly to Plains of Abraham. The battlefield itself is preserved in National Park, visited by tourists who walk the ground where Wolfe died and Montcalm was defeated. Native peoples' losses from Wolfe's victory took generations to fully manifest, but were ultimately catastrophic. With France expelled, British colonial expansion accelerated westward without European power to support native resistance. Pontiac's rebellion in 1763 was crushed. Royal Proclamation of 1763 attempted to reserve western lands for native peoples, but colonial pressure made the proclamation unenforceable. By 1783, American independence created new nation explicitly committed to westward expansion. By 1812, native attempts to create independent homeland with British support failed. By 1830s, removal policies forced eastern native nations westward. By 1890, native military resistance was finished. This process was long and involved many factors, but Wolfe's 1759 victory was a crucial turning point. It eliminated French as ally and protector, leaving native peoples facing British and later American expansion without European support. The human cost of Quebec campaign extends beyond battle casualties. Thousands died from disease during 1759 siege. Canadian civilians lost homes, crops, livelihoods. Families were destroyed. The winter of 1759 to 1760 brought famine. British occupation was often harsh. French-Canadian society was disrupted economically and politically. These costs are easily forgotten when celebrating victory, but were real to people who experienced them. War creates winners and losers in strategic sense, but at human level, nearly everyone loses something. Wolfe himself lost everything: his life, his future with Catherine Lowther, the career he'd worked toward since age 14. He gained immortality and national hero status, but he was dead at 32 and never knew the legacy he'd created. His mother buried him having lost husband and son within a year. Catherine Lowther never married, mourning him for 48 years. These personal tragedies remind us that strategic victories come at individual cost that history often overlooks while celebrating triumph. On September 13, 1759, a chronically ill 32-year-old general forced the battle that conquered Canada for Britain. James Wolfe achieved what military observers considered nearly impossible: scaling cliffs thought unscalable, landing 4,500 troops behind a fortified city defended by 13,000, and forcing the French commander into open-field combat, where British tactics held decisive advantage. Within 15 minutes of battle commencing, French forces were routed. Within hours, Wolfe was dead. Within 5 days, Quebec surrendered. Within a year, Canada was British. One night's audacity and one morning's disciplined firepower changed the continent's future. The human cost of this achievement demands acknowledgement before celebrating strategic brilliance. Wolfe died at 32, never marrying Catherine Lowther, never seeing the empire he'd won. He spent his final weeks in pain, frustration, and fear of failure, achieving triumph only to die at the moment he could finally know success was certain. His last words, "Now God be praised, I will die in peace," came as blood filled his lungs from mortal wounds. Death in victory is romantic in retrospect, but was agony in experience. Montcalm, wounded in the same battle, died the next morning knowing his efforts to defend New France had failed. He was buried in a shell crater because bombardment had made normal burial impossible. Both commanders died violently, painfully, far from home. Beyond these famous deaths, thousands of ordinary soldiers and sailors died, whose names history forgot. Disease killed more than combat. Dysentery, typhus, exposure claimed hundreds during the siege. British raiding parties throughout summer 1759 burned over 1,400 Canadian farms and settlements, leaving families homeless. Crops were destroyed systematically to starve Quebec's defenders, creating famine that killed civilians through winter. The bombardment of Quebec killed civilian residents and destroyed churches, homes, businesses, architectural and cultural heritage reduced to rubble. French casualties in the battle and subsequent campaign approached 3,000 killed and wounded. British casualties exceeded 1,500. These numbers represent individuals, men who died, were maimed, suffered wounds that left them disabled or in chronic pain for whatever life remained. Native peoples allied with France lost more than a single battle. French defeat eliminated their most important European ally and enabled British colonial expansion that overwhelmed native communities across eastern North America over subsequent decades. Nations that had maintained independence through playing European powers against each other found themselves facing British might without French counterweight. Pontiac's rebellion in 1763 was last major attempt at creating independent native homeland in the Great Lakes region. Its failure marked beginning of long decline that ended with removal, reservation confinement, and near destruction of native cultures. Wolfe's victory was catastrophic for native peoples in ways that took generations to fully manifest. The imperial cost of conquering Canada was financial bankruptcy that influenced British policy disastrously. The 7 Years' War cost Britain $82 million, staggering sum that roughly doubled national debt. Post-war British governments attempted recovering costs through colonial taxation. The Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Townshend Acts, and other revenue measures provoked colonial resistance that escalated into American Revolution. The bitter irony was that Britain had fought the war partly to protect American colonies from French threat. Once that threat was eliminated, colonists felt secure enough to resist British authority. The debt incurred conquering Canada required taxation that provoked rebellion. Wolfe's victory contributed to losing 13 colonies within 16 years through removing threat that kept them dependent on British protection. Yet for all its costs, Quebec's conquest was historically decisive. British North America emerged as dominant continental power rather than remaining confined to Atlantic seaboard. The United States, when it achieved independence, inherited British strategic position rather than facing French Canada controlling interior. Modern Canada emerged as bilingual nation, preserving French culture under British political framework. The Quebec Act of 1774 guaranteed French civil law and Catholic practice, creating precedent for cultural tolerance that distinguished Canadian development from American assimilationist approach. September 13, 1759, determined that North America's dominant language would be English rather than French, but also that French culture would survive in Quebec rather than being eliminated. Wolfe's personal legacy remains powerful 265 years after his death. His name adorns streets, towns, and institutions across the English-speaking world. Westminster Abbey's monument commemorates him among Britain's honoured dead. Benjamin West's painting depicting his death remains an iconic image of heroic sacrifice. Wolfe became shorthand for brave commander willing to risk everything for victory. His tactical writings were studied at military academies. His decisions at Quebec were analysed as examples of creative problem-solving and acceptable risk-taking. He entered national mythology as ideal of selfless military service. Young, brilliant, personally brave, dying victorious. Modern reassessment acknowledges Wolfe's faults alongside his achievements. He was harsh disciplinarian who ordered floggings liberally. His raiding party's destruction of Canadian settlements was militarily questionable and morally indefensible. His relationship with subordinates was often poor. Brigadiers questioned his judgment in writing. He succeeded at Quebec partly through boldness and skill, but also through fortune that could easily have failed. A more alert French sentry, a different tide schedule, Bougainville positioned slightly closer. Any could have made the landing catastrophic failure. Wolfe was brave and ultimately successful, but he was also lucky and sometimes reckless. He remains fascinating not as perfect hero, but as complex individual whose gamble succeeded. Montcalm's reassessment has been similarly nuanced. For generations, he was blamed for attacking hastily rather than waiting for reinforcements. Modern historians recognize his impossible situation. Waiting allowed British to consolidate and establish artillery threatening Quebec directly. Attacking immediately risked defeat, but offered chance of driving British off the plateau before they entrenched. Neither choice was safe. Montcalm chose the active risk rather than passive one, and lost. But criticizing that choice from historical distance, knowing how it ended, is easier than making it facing time pressure and incomplete information. Montcalm defended Canada competently for 3 years with inadequate resources. His defeat came against overwhelming British advantages in resources, naval power, and strategic position. He deserves recognition for fighting effectively in losing cause rather than blame for failing to overcome impossible odds. The battle itself, 15 minutes of devastating volley fire, demonstrated timeless military principles. Discipline under fire matters more than individual courage. Coordinated action defeats uncoordinated action. Firepower properly applied overwhelms mass. Tactical advantage exploited decisively wins battles faster than prolonged combat. These principles applied in 1759 with muskets apply in modern warfare with different weapons. Military academies worldwide study Plains of Abraham as example of classic battle execution. Force enemy into unfavorable terrain, maintain discipline, apply maximum force decisively, exploit victory immediately. The technology changes, the principles endure. Quebec's battlefield is preserved today in National Park, where visitors walk the Plains of Abraham, stand where Wolfe died, view the cliffs British troops scaled in darkness. The site commemorates both sides. Wolfe and Montcalm are honored as commanders who fought bravely for their nations. This dual commemoration reflects Canadian identity. Nation forged from British conquest, but preserving French culture, where September 13, 1759, is remembered as foundational moment whose meaning differs for Anglophone and Francophone Canadians. For some, it's Day British won Canada. For others, Day New France fell. Both perspectives are valid. Both are part of Canadian story. From our perspective, 2.5 centuries later, Quebec 1759 appears inevitable. British resources, naval superiority, and population advantages made French defeat likely. But inevitability is retrospective illusion. Wolfe could have failed. The landing could have been discovered. Montcalm could have declined battle. Weather could have prevented the operation. Quebec could have held through 1759, forcing British to withdraw and return in 1760. The outcome seems determined only because we know how it ended. Contemporaries facing these decisions didn't have that knowledge. Wolfe risked everything on gamble that succeeded through combination of planning, execution, and fortune. That's what makes his achievement remarkable. Not that victory was inevitable, but that he forced it through audacious action when cautious commanders would have withdrawn. September 13, 1759. The day a chronically ill 32-year-old general climbed impossible cliffs, forced an impossible battle, won an impossible victory, and died at the moment of triumph. James Wolfe never saw the empire he'd won, never married the woman he loved, never knew that his name would be celebrated for centuries. He gambled everything on one night's landing and one morning's battle. He won Canada for Britain, reshaped North American history, and died knowing only that French forces were fleeing and victory was certain. Personal sacrifice and continental change met on Plains of Abraham that morning. The young general died, the empire expanded, and North America would never be the same.